Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks. Welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch, as they said. I'm honored to be joined by a couple of Australian superstars here to talk about. The title might be a little bit misleading, From Subsea to Edge, but that's okay. We're going to cover a wide area. We're going to talk about Australia. We're probably going to talk about things outside of Australia. And I would actually ask if my panelists could just do a quick self-introduction, because I couldn't do them honor, I'm sure. But we'll start with Bevan. Amanda does not need an introduction, but maybe you'd do a quick word.
Bevan Slattery, been involved in the industry through various forms for the last 30 years. Pipe Networks, NextDC, Superloop, Megaport, Subpartner, Subco, Cloud Scene. So I've done everything from data centres, metro fibre, long-haul fibre, and subsea, and cloud interconnection.
Ollie.
And Ollie Curtis, co-founder, co-CEO of Firmus Technologies. Unlike my very esteemed friend to the right here, I'm a relatively newcomer to the industry. So started the business about 7 years ago, and we've got a verticalised neocloud based out of here in Singapore, but expanding back into Australia.
Great. And I fell victim as well, forgot to introduce myself. Daryl Dunbar. I'm a consultant in the data center space. I've been in and around the industry about 30 years myself, starting out in the US and then in Europe, and then moved to Asia. Singapore about 10 years ago. I was bullish on the market back then. I was probably a little early, but I wasn't wrong. I think is the key. So loving it and still working in the industry and advising people now. So let's get on with the panel and talk about interesting stuff. I'm actually going to ask each of you this question. So I'll start with you, Bevan. What do you think differentiates Australia as an investment destination in this market space?
I think a couple of key things that's becoming more apparent to the industry, and particularly hyperscalers as well, and I've just spent a fair bit of time with them this week up the road at something else. They're really understanding the value of diversity, and there's a lot changing in the world, and the benefits to Australia are there's plenty of land, there's some power. For data centres, I don't know if you can ever have enough power, but there's power, there's land, but also there's diversity from areas we've seen issues in South China Sea, the Red Sea and things like that. So I think what they're looking for is a safe pair of hands, place that is allowed to host chips under the US. So it's starting to tick a lot of boxes from an investment standpoint. Good common law, consistent, good government, at least consistent government, but certainly the diversification through there and the availability of infrastructure, mostly it.
Right, great. Ollie, what would you add to that?
I mean, there's not much to add, really. I mean, Australia certainly was a little behind the eight ball in relation to specifically the wave that we're talking about at the moment. But I think that, with kind of the stable government that we've got and policies that are being put in place, I do think that you're going to see that there's, exactly as Bevan says, reap the rewards associated with the abundance of, amount of energy, as well as vast amounts of land that really lend itself to an area that can be actually, most importantly, cost effective. I mean, I think one of the conversations that I have a lot, certainly with similar people, is that I think there's a significant misunderstanding associated with actually the cost advantages of Australia. So, we do have a relatively good currency advantage as far as cost, and that actually means when there's substantially cheaper land and substantially cheaper, capital cost to build certain things, that it does come back and flow through to very important component parts that go into investment decisions. So, I think cost competitiveness is a big advantage in Australia.
So we were just talking outside before the session, and I wanted to touch on something that we were talking about, and it's sort of whether it's a comparison or where you think, and I'll start with you, Ollie, where you think Australia falls with regards to some of the emerging markets, and in the particular market that you operate in, and by that I mean the AI, the foundation stuff. Johor.
Yeah. So look,
the elephant in the Southeast Asian room.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've got a bit of personal experience because we obviously left Australia and we came up to Singapore, and Singapore's got its own challenges associated with, frankly speaking, one of the most expensive places in the world to be able to even contemplate hosting GPUs. But I think that the general consensus in what I call the first wave, and we've only been, it's really only been 2 years, right? But the first wave of capital goes into the kind of general, what I'm saying, slight misunderstanding that, you have to be in kind of Southeast Asia areas to be cost competitive in Asia, right? Because there's this general tendency to think that Australia, for example, and New Zealand for that matter, are very expensive places. And I think that, that is the first wave. Now, the first wave in this investment thematic, in my opinion, obviously comes from a CapEx build-out that is substantial, and then all of a sudden, that brings with it government policies from certain regions that want to attract that first amount of capital in. I think that, it's not incorrect to say that policies are fantastic, certainly around Johor and other regions, to attract that. But then when you actually dig a little bit deeper and you understand their energy policy, you understand the source of that energy, and then in turn understand that a lot of the cheap energy is actually being subsidised, and that subsidy can be taken away from you very quickly. You've got to think about this, that this is 30 to 40 year infrastructure assets, right? So I think that there is going to be a bit of a reassessment with where is deemed to be the right place to build the long-term generational asset class that we're undertaking here. And I think that it's a bit of a tortoise and the hare scenario, and I think the tortoise, certainly in this scenario, would likely be somewhere like Australia because much more friendly geopolitical stability as well.
Sure. Turning to you, Bevan, similar question, but something you didn't explicitly mention, but you kind of implied it, and that's connectivity to Australia. I think there's a perception, and I think you just said that, Ollie, that, you've got to be in Asia to be relevant to Asia, you've got to be in Southeast Asia, but Australia is not that far away connectivity-wise, is it?
No, it's 50 milliseconds to about 3 billion people. So, and that's a return path. So, you're within the blink of an eye of 3 billion people, which is, Indonesia 300, China, India. It's pretty impressive from a latency perspective. So, I think that's something that's been not understood. 5 years ago, I was talking about building what I'm kind of building now, which is I could just see this transformation that was going to happen, which is. I'm mostly in submarine cable business these days, and now these ships that we use, they've almost been rented for the next 5 years. It's very hard to get a ship now. So even if you can get a cable manufactured, the likes of Google have rented like pretty much an entire fleet. But so when I kind of look at the connectivity piece, I could also see the challenges in South China Sea. I didn't quite predict the Red Sea being exactly how it's going down now, but I always saw that as a risk, and Malacca Straits as a risk. Every single submarine cable in the world that goes from Europe and Middle East to Singapore, which is Asia,
right,
goes through the same 25 kilometres of water in the Malacca Strait, except for mine. But I had this strong belief that Australia has an outsized role to play, not because of it being Australia, but everything that goes from the US to Singapore pretty much went through South China Sea.
Correct.
And that was going to become a problem. Not a problem, but you can't over-invest in that. So, yeah, I've had a pretty big belief in what we're doing. And the cable that we're building right now, which is SNAP, which is Sydney to Melbourne to Adelaide to Perth Subsea, by the time we finish building it, it'll be completely gone. We've only got 2 pairs of 16 pairs left on that system, and that's because the hyperscalers are now building multiple systems from the US to Australia. Mm-hmm. They've already announced Australia into Singapore, one of them. Another one's just announced Meta around the world. It's coming to Darwin, it's leaving Darwin, and I think we're going to see probably another 3 cables announced out of the Western Australia into Asia, India, Middle East in the next 12 months. And that is everyone going, hey, we need to get massive connectivity that's diverse and secure through the region.
Yeah, so diversity is definitely key. And I think I mentioned it when outside that if you just look over the last 2-3 years, the Philippines has gone from 9 cable landing stations to 12 and now 18. And that's just an indicator. If you look on a map, if you think about it, where the Philippines sits on a map, it is the way around the South China Sea, coming up from Indonesia, Australia, etc. So logical. Staying with you, Bevan, I just wanted to know, with all the great experience that you have, what do you think the path forward looks like for Australia in our industry in general?
The most fundamental thing is, from my side, we need to make sure that we're the safe harbour for the Indo-Pacific region, right? That is it in a nutshell. Because it's 25 million people, but I think it's not about the 25 million people. The case in point is Singapore. You know, when I was first coming here, I bought a network here back in 2012, Verizon's underground duct network, and built a fibre network, which is now Zenith IG over here, right? It's 4 million people, but its outsized role in the region is, I think, unparalleled. It's exceptional. And I think Australia needs to, it's not because I want it to be, but it has to be that outsized role. When you look at, all the traffic flowing from the US across, it's Japan, Guam/Philippines, and Australia. So, and then we have to get there. So I think it's number one thing for me is to be that safe harbour and that hub for that, which means, data centres, AI, connectivity, digital infrastructure being available there. It's not just about us being sovereign, but it's about us also, from the country perspective, is about us to be that interconnection hub that Singapore plays today.
Right, so playing an outsized role in the region, much to the point of what Singapore did for many, many years. And people came, why did they come to Singapore initially? They came because of Western rule of law. They came because of a friendly government. They came because it was geographically well-connected and easy to get to. And I think in the beginning, we probably thought it was actually going to be Hong Kong. And that first, and Singapore sort of stole a march on Hong Kong from a digital infrastructure perspective, much like they've done financially.
Well, just on that, Singapore kind of was winning and had almost won, and then Hong Kong became that gateway to China. Right. I remember we used to have all our big hyperscale customers, and you have a chat back in the day, and they're all in Singapore, but they all started migrating to Hong Kong. And then something changed up there, and then all of a sudden it all kind of came back. So, yeah, Singapore kept that role. It was almost going to lose it. Not lose it, but it was going to become number 2, I think, or at risk at parity. But within the space of 12 months, it all just started unwinding, and look where it is today.
Right. Raises the interesting question that's probably outside of this panel, but about Johor, and is Johor stealing a march on Singapore? An interesting question. Ollie, I'm going to parrot back your phrase as a relative newcomer into the market. I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you see the way forward for Australia?
Look, I think, as Bevan says, I think, first and foremost, Australia has been pretty fortunate that they've had a few pretty big players in the digital infrastructure place do pretty well. So there's been a pretty early wave of investment into some good-sized, substantial assets. Clearly, Bevan's business and cable has been very important for setting the backbone, because, as Bevan says, it's 5 years to lay a cable, get the planning and do all that sort of thing. So what's most important is that we're in a once-in-a-generational investment cycle that's effectively got this profile over the next 5 years at a minimum, where the supply-demand profile is, as long as you can connect and you can build and you can find resources, there's going to be capital to allow you to do that, because, frankly speaking, you're building the substations of electrification, right? So I think that, as I said in the beginning, Australia's policy needs to be pretty clear that they are open for business associated with creating what I believe to be a very important new industry in Australia. And I talk about this a lot because I see myself as a commodity producer, right? We sell GPU hours, but in turn we really sell AI tokens, as Jensen articulates, right? So what's fascinating, because I come from the mining background, is that I spend a lot of my time explaining to financiers and investors and everybody that actually just look at this like a commodity play, right? And what's Australia benefited from for generations? We've been a massive net exporter of physical commodities for a long time. So you parlay that into what we're doing as far as an industry and an investment cycle, and you turn around and you say these gigawatt campus investments require tens of billions of dollars of investment. They're 50-year infrastructure assets. Sure, you've got to compute recyclement and all that sort of thing, but that's just another reinvestment. But ultimately, you need to make sure you're setting yourself up for the long term. And I think that with all the benefits of the early wave of kind of Australia being, you know, obviously geopolitically safe, with the good cables, with cheap land and all that sort of thing, I mean, I openly say that, you know, I would hope that Australia has the opportunity to become the second largest exporter of AI tokens in the world, because we do have that opportunity, right? And so once understood, I think that the real opportunity for Australia is to just make sure that they have the right policy and play the long game, very similar to sort of, you know, the leadership that Singapore has, which is thinking multi-generationally. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the wave that we've got has to be captured, because if you miss the wave, it'll be built somewhere else. But if it's built in Australia, then, you know, I think it can have just huge flow-on effects for future generations and other industry.
Right. Either or both of you, what's holding Australia back?
I'll take that. I mean, I wouldn't say anything's necessarily holding Australia back. Australia's got a little bit of complexity associated with some copyright laws, which has to do with the ability to natively train LLMs in Australia on Australian data. I think that that's genuinely going to be resolved in the not too distant future, which is really just about recompense associated with, you know, digital creators' ability to actually receive income. As long as that does change, but even in saying that, you can still train an LLM in Australia and just not use Australian data. But it's, as long as that's not a material problem, then I think policy has taken a bit of time to be really well considered. And I think that because Australia kind of missed the very, very early phases and it was very focused on traditional data centres and co-location, this next wave of AI factories has taken some time to actually get people to understand exactly what is this investment thematic. Because an AI factory in this AI industry is very different to building, you know, your traditional colo. I mean, there's hotels and then there's factories. They're not the same asset class. So I think that there's certainly no lack of capital in Australia. There's no lack of land access. There's incredibly rich and deep amount of pipeline for renewable energy, which is a hugely important part of this setting it up on the base foundation layer correctly. Yeah, I mean, the only thing that can really get in its way is lack of vision from a government policy point of view. So, you know, I believe this government has a good understanding of what the opportunity is, and frankly, I think it's bipartisan understanding of this being a generationally important opportunity.
I think that's a really good answer, and I think I'm in the world of mostly linear infrastructure, and when you talk to the political people about digital infrastructure, it seems to some of them so abstract. To them, it's the tangible, touchy-feely part about, you know, okay, it's a data centre. No, I mean, how many people in the political sense have actually toured a data centre? But right. I can tell you, it's a lot more than they've actually been on a submarine cable ship. So, so for me, I've got to say, building linear infrastructure in Australia, I've done a lot of it over decades. It is very difficult. It's actually, some parts of states are easy. You have federal laws, federal things, which is okay. But there's one or two states that's very hard, very hard. I think that's going to be a little bit unwound. And so what I've done in this project, on Monday, we have a big cable ship. It's sort of on the cable. And on Monday, I had I paid for an extra day for the ship to stay in port so I could take tours. And so I'll take usually the state premier, ministers. I actually take government bureaucrats. I'll take customers as well and future customers. I actually have to take them on this thing. And every time you take a premier on that ship, it's the biggest cable laying ship in the world. It's 150 metres long. It holds 8,000 tonnes. It's 5,000 kilometres of cable. You take them on this ship and their eyes just go like that. And the good example is I had the West Australian Premier, South Australian, on Monday, a few months back, I had him. And I was explaining to him, I said, I gave him a bit of a spiel beforehand, and he'd never been in a cable ship, understood submarine cables. I said, look, this is my 4th cable I've laid into Perth.
Right.
And he's kind of like, oh, wow. And I said, the thing to understand is Western Australia has this amazing opportunity. The internet is being completely rewired, right, to avoid South China Sea, Red Sea, whatever. We have an outsized role to play. And I said, here's what you need to think about Perth. Have you heard of the Dubai airport? Have you heard of Singapore airport? He goes, yeah. I said, this is the place where all the cables should be coming into, interconnect. You want to go from US to Africa, you can actually go this route, get to Perth, cable across. Singapore, here. And you can see his eyes light up. So I think getting that buy-in from government on that side and the importance of leading infrastructure, I think is important. And so really, I think just getting the awareness of it, that will help us get the approvals and probably change in policy and framework and legislation to make that happen. I think also, what Ollie and the team have done at Firmus, what they've been able to do also is, we talk about energy, and he probably doesn't want to say it too much because, it's part of his secret sauce, but the renewable energy that he's been able to tap into is exceptional, in Tasmania, in terms of, but that's one part, I know where you're going. Price is fantastic, but the fact it's nearly, I think, 100% renewable, if not the closest thing to it, is quite exceptional. So I think, one, building leading infrastructure, it's a global problem. The US is leading the way in how to actually fix that. I mean, regardless of politics, Donald Trump has said, hey, if you need energy, we'll let you build it, microgrids, we'll let you build it. We need to get out of the way and do that. So I think that has been the problem, but I think it's going to become solved shortly.
Great, I appreciate that. I think we all saw your LinkedIn post on Monday with the premiere on the ship. So if not, like and follow. That's one for the alpha generation or whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about. So I think before we move on to energy, and I do want to get there, I think it's really, really great. And I think you really touched on something great there, Bevan. I want to hear from you guys about regulation. And that's a dirty word, but there's a couple of subtopics in here. Regulation, government activity. I think you correctly summed it up. And Claude said it earlier in his talk about the Trump administration's made it pretty clear that they don't want to regulate anything. They've even killed a regulator or a AI safety board. He shot it and said forget it because it stifles innovation. So what does Australia need to do? Is that I hear education. But I think there's a risk in regulation slowing things down and not to get too deep into it, but clearly the difference, I've personally experienced the difference between the WA government and trying to get a DA through approval in Sydney, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, just to lead off on this, I mean, I've just obviously very recently had approval of very substantial data centre DAs. I think that the regulation comes in two forms, right? You've got your federal government-led generalised policy that flows all the way back into specific areas that, for example, Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, is a very complicated, very bureaucratic organisation. Fantastic and incredibly important because Australia, what people don't realise, Australia is is the largest interconnected grid in the world. Right, so from all the way from Tasmania, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, all interconnected. So it's one of the most complicated grids in the world. What actually needs to happen is there needs to be just some generalised understanding, and I think leadership from industry, to be able to say this is best in class and this is what we need to do, so that there's an education point. Because on the bureaucratic side, they've just got to know what's coming. There's too much piecemeal kind of, I want to do, every man and his dog wants to build a data centre these days, so they'll go and just lodge an application with their TNSP and then, clog up the system. So there should be a very straight answer to, do you tick these boxes? If you don't tick these boxes, get out of the way. Because what I think is dangerous is if it's not so much regulation that's the problem. Because I'm saying the DA and building approvals and all that sort of a thing, well, that's your own responsibility to make sure that you have A, a social licence to operate in the area that you're actually trying to develop, but B, more importantly, you just do everything in the responsible way that obviously, hopefully means that you're not going to have community blast back. But just coming back to the regulation side, I think that what I find interesting, because we have this, what we'll call is a semi-bubble in data centre development, as far as every person thinking they can now build a data centre, you end up getting this clog of uneducated development approvals effectively, and that's a dangerous position to be. And I think that really, if there was one thing that regulation needs to, or policy in relation to regulation that needs to be put in place, it really should be centred around making sure that there's a very high standard of information that makes it much easier for the bureaucrats on the other side and AMO to just tick it off. I mean, you've got to do these very complicated things called PSCADs and all that sort of stuff that virtually models effectively the impact of your data centre coming into a grid, right? And so, I just think there's a distinct lack of understanding of the complexities associated with the electricity side of things. And when you're talking about hundreds of megawatts of load, what impact that can have. And unfortunately in Australia, it has a flow-on effect across many, many, many states. So,
Yep, for sure. And I think there's a good bit of misinformation or disinformation out there about just how nasty data centers are, right? That's become a public thing. And it goes back to your statement, Bevan, about sort of educating politicians about that.
Yeah, and look, I could give a 3-hour podcast on regulation.
And we'd all listen.
We're doing 6 separate cable landings, and 5 of 6 are in non-protection zones. No one's done landings at these locations before. Let me give you, I think from a regulation standpoint, if all that you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think the second part is some of the regulation's fine. We just need to have a filter that says, is this so minimal risk, it doesn't need to jump through the same hoops that we've got. I could give you, I swear to God, I'll give you 10 examples, but let me give you one. So we did this landing off Maroubra Beach in Sydney. We actually did a landing for us. We did landings for Google as well. That's public, I can say that. So we created a whole new landing zone for 6 cables. We're doing 2, they're doing whatever. Now, in my hobby, I have a group called Biopixel and Oceans Foundation. So I'm going to build 1 million square metres of tolerant reef in the next 10 years as part of my passion project. So our family's the biggest funder of megafauna research in Australia through Biopixel. So I know a thing or two about sharks and stingrays and stuff. So I'm doing this landing in Maroubra off Sydney, and there's 2.9 kilometres, about 3 kilometres, 4 kilometres offshore. That is a bit of a regulatory zone. We put in our permits approvals to do the duct, and then we put our permit approval to run a cable in. Now, a cable's that big. That's how big the cable is. The ship will be coming in for 2 days. It'll be travelling between 1 knot and 0 knot. Right? It'll be stationary. Cable goes up a pipe, pops up somewhere in the beach or behind the beach, and no one's even going to know what's going on, except there'll be a ship out there for 2 days, and it'll go and lay the cable. The environmental permits, they said, hey, there is a grey nurse shark population there that's incredibly sensitive, 100 metres park, and they said, and also we're worried about whales, we're worried about all this other stuff, which, trust me, I understand how these things work. The amount of money we were going to have to spend on this, and they asked us to move it, and I said, look, and they said, because these grey nurse sharks pup there, and they breed and pup there. And I said, look, okay, I can tell you that's not right, because we just shot a series for Nat Geo on grey nurse sharks. They actually do that up near the Queensland border. And I said, secondly, what you need to understand is it's a cable that's that big. If there is a shark dumb enough to actually swim into the boat at 1 knot, look, there isn't, because Newton's theory, Darwin's theory said sharks wouldn't be around anymore. But I said, here's the thing you need to understand. Right beside that shark reserve you're worried about, there is 150 metres of shark net. 500 metres of shark net. Then there is 3 shark buoys before it can get to the boat. That shark net, along with One North, has killed 100 sharks over the past 8 years. And so if you're worried about that, how about we remove the shark net that's killing sharks every other day and the buoys? And I said, on top of that, if you're worried about the environment, the world's largest discharge of effluent, the single largest discharge of treated effluent in the entire southern hemisphere, a lot of countries, happens a kilometre away over there. I said 10 swimming pools of treated effluent goes out every hour of every day, 365 days a year. And you want me to go through an environmental report for a cable that's that big that you won't even know that's there for 25 years? That's an example of, let's just call it very, I'd say, regulation that's missed where it really needs to be focused on.
Right.
And I could give you 10 examples of that stupidity. So
Sure. Absolutely.
I'm very passionate about it because I had to pay the pain.
Good.
Sorry about that.
No worries at all. Just for the audience, in the lotto, whoever had 26 minutes before Bevan mentioned his passion project, see me afterwards. But no, it's in all seriousness, I think it's great. On the regulation thing, I want to touch a little bit on data sovereignty or data residency, and the sort of subtle difference between those two, because I think a lot of people are going out and screaming, they're using sovereign. Even Jensen's running around saying you need a sovereign AI. What are your thoughts on that? Sort of tying us in, Ollie, to the regulation thought.
Yeah, I mean, look, data sovereignty is absolutely essential, and frankly speaking, we're in this wave where there is 5 major LLM developers, the majority of which are trained by large American corporations. And in turn, these are not agentic at this point in time, so, they're fed and taught in a certain way. And there is absolutely no doubt that when you export that into other regions, that there can be a, fast forward 6-7 years, a loss of understanding of certain sovereign, whether it be cultures or differences, because it's just not necessarily trained that way. So I think that, data sovereignty is not just actually about can you use the data? It's actually about effectively what is the use case and output for the use of that data. Because, let's take, for example, what Singapore does here. Singapore's been fantastic and very forward in their AI policy. And, they first and foremost figured out that they needed to stop and pause data centre development, and they need to figure out the best way to build data centres. They put the Green Data Centre Roadmap out way before anybody else really in the world thought about that process. And at the same time with their AI policy, they've been very focused on making sure that AI Singapore, it's public information, AI Singapore is building Sea-Line, a Singapore government trained LLM based off effectively sovereign data. Now, that sort of requirements and minimum investment into your history, country's history, shouldn't even be in question. It shouldn't even be in question. So I think what happens when you define data sovereignty and sovereign capacity, there's kind of 2 different formats. One is really just fundamentally for our children's children, there should be, not necessarily too much of a bias based off, maybe American ways. But secondarily, I think that then when you parlay that into, well, how is actually put forth, sovereign-owned GPU capacity, whether you like it or not, is an essential asset for a nation, right? I mean, we're in a wave of investment that is very clear that, you know, there's many superpowers trying to build the largest amount of clusters in the world, and ultimately, I think, you know, you'll definitely find a region of have and have-nots. Now, what you don't want to find, particularly here in Asia, is the have-nots simply because they A, don't have access to GPUs, or B, don't have access to power, just effectively gets overshadowed by you know, influences in other regions. So I think, you know, we're very passionate about what we're doing down in Australia, being Australian, you know, headquartered and Australian owned, on trying to make sure that, you know, as a Five Eyes nation, Australia has the capacity to in fact build substantial amounts of AI compute that can be consumed in country. But, you know, I think it's very important that even if the hyperscalers and or any of the large LLM players come into a country, you know, it should be trained or used, their platform should be trained on assets and hardwares that is owned by sovereign entities, because it creates jobs, you keep taxes in that area, and, you know, in turn you get the flow-on effect for other benefits, right? So,
right. Great. Thanks for that. We've got a few minutes left. I just want to turn to the audience really quick and see if anybody but Claude has... No, I'm sorry. Claude has a question. Can we get a microphone over here, please? If anybody else has a question, cue it up. Great opportunity here.
Thanks, Daryl. I have two questions. The first one for Bevan. You mentioned this map cable. So my question is there a business case, and if not today, when, under what conditions, to extend that cable to Darwin and then eventually do all around Australia, down Brisbane, like to Africa, for example, right? And the second question I have is for Oliver, but welcome, Bevan, as well. Again, staying with West Australia, and you said Australia missed the first wave for AI training. So now the second wave, is that where renewable energy is? And therefore, is there more a case in Western Australia than it is in typical Sydney, Melbourne areas where the data centers have been so far?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the SMAP cable's pretty much, it'll be out of capacity by the time I finish. I was going to go to Brisbane originally as well, so if people understand, it's basically from the west coast, more southern part, all the way to Sydney. I was going to go a bit further north, build 2 terrestrial routes and then a whole bunch of stuff. But what I actually had to do, I've done that, but it's my kind of capital. I still personally own 100% of Subco. What I see, I think the best bang for buck for me in servicing Australia, I'm already solving that east-west problem, I think, is to create safe corridors between nations and Australia, you know, maybe Australia, Singapore, maybe Australia, US, maybe additional investment. So if I was going to spend, you know, $500 million over the next 5 years, where do I think is the best way to do that? And you know, I did say I'm never building another submarine cable again. I have said that 3 times. So, but I think that's probably more of my focus. That's partly already being solved. Meta's W cable, the around the world cable. This segment's going from India to Darwin to the US. That's becoming, there are some terrestrial players being built. So I think that'll be solved, but I actually think the bigger issue right now is, you're right, new corridors. I think that's, if you're going to invest $1 billion, I think that's probably the better thing to do.
Yeah, and just in relation to your second question, I mean, make no mistake, the first wave definitely was just built wherever you could get access to power. I think there's a better understanding now that, again, thinking about long term, that, you know, green AI and green AI tokens really will end up being something that's a point of differentiation. I think that as it pertains to Australia's opportunity, different states have different cost profile, not just from an energy point of view, but actually from a land point of view. Certainly as it pertains to what we are doing from a Firmus point of view, every single one of our DCs is powered by 100% renewable energy. We believe that is for 2 reasons: fundamentally, social license to operate, and, you know, a point of differentiation, and secondarily, really it does come down to cost competitiveness, right? And I think that when you look at the size of the infrastructure investment that we ourselves are investing into, without being flippant, let's say you're doing a 400 megawatt site, 140,000 GPUs. You're talking about $10 billion US. Now, to go and get 400 megawatts of renewable, actually, from a PPA point of view, it's going to cost, let's say, $150 million a year in energy costs, right? Well, if you've got a $10 billion US investment into the DC and into the GPU compute, realistically, what's another $1 billion into some renewable energy that both mix of solar and wind and BESS that actually then in turn supports lowering your cost of production, because ultimately you're really changing it from a operating cost to a cost of capital, right? So I think definitely the opportunity in Australia is to concentrate in regions that either have excess energy, and usually that excess energy requires baseload, because baseload then supports better grid stability. I would hope that the industry, certainly that does get built in Australia, is very focused on making sure it is being built based off green electrons.
Great. I've got one more quick question. What's the biggest risk to investors? Either one of you, jump in.
Look, I talk about, just as it pertains to the way I see the world, I think the biggest risk to investors is a lack of understanding of what can end up being legacy tech debt. Now, what I mean by that is that unless you go all the way through the supply chain, from electrons to the output of the AI token, it's a very fractured industry, right? There's stop points, and stop points create inefficiency. Inefficiency creates increasing cost. Increasing costs, if you're building a 30-year infrastructure asset, is not where you need to be. So I would say that there needs to be a stronger understanding of engineering core principles, a stronger understanding of actually what is being built, because as I said before, a co-location cloud data center is a fantastic asset that's going to grow at 30% compound year on year. But those data centers do not have the ability to do specialty infrastructure, right? And so I would say, I think the biggest risk is that, data centers ain't data centers, as I say. And it is absolutely important that people and money understands that there is a completely different asset class that is being built, and you need to have a materially better understanding of the right way to build things, because your thought of a 20-year infrastructure asset can be, actually, the risk is that there is a better way to build it that's half the cost, that then all of a sudden your tens of billions of dollars of investment is redundant.
Yep, absolutely. Consulting in this space, I couldn't agree with you more. And gosh, I've got a bunch more questions we could go on. This time has just flown by. But if I could ask the audience to join me in thanking Bevan and Ollie for their time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daryl.